right, everybody, and welcome to this leadership episode of 30 Minutes to President's Club. My name is Armand Froke, and I'm here with my illustrious goon of a co-host, Nick Sigelski. And today, we have a multiple-time guest on 30 MPC. It's the one and only Jason Bay, but this time, he's on the leadership show. Why? Because he teaches folks how to get their reps off their bums and in the field prospecting. Nick, why should people listen?
Jason's got some really good stuff as it relates to getting people to prospect. Everything from how you build out the math to show people this is exactly how much prospecting you need to do. And then we talk about here's how you hold people accountable and regularly upskill them on those minimum viable areas. So this was a really good one if you're trying to get the team back on the prospecting wagon.
Alrighty, Jason, welcome to the leadership show. We start every show with your top 3 leadership takeaways. Let's get your 3.
Let's do it. So number 1 is dial in your sales math. So the big mistake that I see orgs make is they throw out arbitrary activity targets. So if you're an account executive and maybe you're listening to the leadership episode this time around, nothing's worse than your leadership telling you all of a sudden now you got to put in 30 outbound activities per day. So instead, what you want to do is dial in your sales math. You literally want to reverse engineer what you want to earn for your commission down to the revenue that you need to close, the number of deals that you need to have in pipeline to close the number of deals that you need to hit the revenue target, the number of intro calls you need to run to have those opportunities, and then you're going to work down into your pipeline coverage targets. If you have 4x pipeline coverage, let's say, you know that I need to have 4 times the amount of opportunities to meet my target. So you're going to find a way to work down into how many intro meetings do I need down to how many outbound activities do I need in order to get those meetings. You literally want to have a number that says every day I need to do 26 outbound activities to hit my target.
Let's go. What's number 2?
Number 2 is enablement on tactics, way more than process. I work with a lot of really large sales teams, and I think the larger your company gets, the larger the enablement team gets. And I love enablement folks. I love ops folks, but there can be this motion inside the company where we spend hours on a weekly and monthly basis enabling around how to use the tooling, how to adhere to the process. But hey, when a prospect says hello on a cold call, what the heck do I say to them next? When they tell me that they're using their competitor, what do I say next? So the thing that you want to do instead is to build what I call an outbound squad at your company. So let's say you have hundreds of reps, doesn't matter what the size. You're going to pick your top 2 or 3 AEs in each segment, top 2 or 3 SDRs. You're going to throw an enablement person in the mix and a sales leader that really cares about the outbound messaging. And you're going to say, hey, our personas, who are they? What do they care about? Let's create common standard language that we can use in our cold email templates and our talk tracks. Create a squad from those people, and that's what you're going to roll out to the rest of the org. Second thing is you want to work with your enablement people. Enablement is really good at capturing and documentation. They're going to be the best people to capture and document and create those playbooks. And lastly, what you want to do to facilitate the skill improvement as a frontline leader, every single hour meeting that you do on a weekly basis with your team needs to be spent on skill improvement. Specifically for if outbound is a big focus, specifically for outbound. You literally need to bring in sample emails that your reps have sent, provide group coaching in that meeting, get your reps to provide coaching, coach cold call recordings. You need to provide the same level of reinforcement and coaching that you would for a rep working deals.
Alrighty.
Execute together. One of the biggest lessons I was taught by my VP of sales back in the day, a guy named Dan, was, and this is back when I was working for a company where we went door to door selling house painting services. And my team wasn't doing enough door to door. And he called me up and left a voicemail. I'll never forget. He said something along the lines of, the reason why they're not doing it is when it's time for them to do it, you leave the territory and you head off to work somewhere else, or you go eat dinner early. You don't participate in the activity with them. You don't rub shoulders. I was like, oh man, it's that lesson has stuck with me for the last decade and a half of, we need to show our team that we're willing to rub shoulders and do the activity with them. And as a manager, you need to show them that you can still do it. So what I recommend, I call them get shit done sessions. My best customers have a 1 hour block or 2 1 hour blocks per week, prospecting blocks, where they schedule in their team's calendar. It's non-negotiable. Unless you're working the biggest deal of your life, you have to show up to the block. Manager rub shoulders. They make calls. They call coach the reps. Everyone's prospecting during that time. That needs to be a mandatory piece. The second thing is CRO and VP of sales, you need to participate too. Sure, you're not going to be making cold calls every week, but you should be celebrating in the team Slack channel, in your one-on-ones with your frontline leaders, in the all hands calls. You need to celebrate the successes that people are having from an outbound standpoint, and you need to talk about it and live it and share those stories.
So Jason, I want to ask you about this sales math. You talked about working backwards, where I'm like, okay, what do I want to earn from commission? What do I need to close revenue-wise to earn that? How many deals do I need? That implies I need to know my average deal size. How many deals in pipeline do I need to have using our average pipeline coverage to close ratio? And then I've got to figure out how many intro calls lead to those ops and how many outbound activities that I need to perform in order to actually make all of that work. I'm thinking about it from the perspective of most of the companies I've worked at, where getting extremely accurate data like that just wasn't going to happen. So am I totally screwed if I work at a company like that?
Yeah. So your ops person, they're going to be the best people to get you some of these pipeline metrics. But let's say that you don't really have good, clean, accurate data. Here's some really good places to start and rough benchmarks that you could use. So a typical account executive will have somewhere around a 30% win rate on qualified opportunities. Let's use that as the win rate. So when someone enters qualified pipeline, weighted pipeline, whatever you call it, if around 30% of those close, that's a kind of a good standard benchmark to work with. The next one I would look at is conversion rate of first meeting into op. So your stage 1 or stage 2 into weighted pipeline. And then what I would look at is somewhere around 60 to 80 outbound activities it takes to land a meeting. So you could use that as a rough starting point. And I think the big thing is that whatever you decide to start with, make sure that you're tracking it properly. If you're managing a group of account executives, make sure that they're using the outreach tool and make sure that they're actually logging the tasks so you guys can build some good, accurate data. So use that as a starting point.
So I'm a leader of a sales team and I'm like, okay, we've got to do the sales math in order to show the AEs, how am I making this sales math actually real for folks to encourage them to prospect?
So this is a principle that just works across the entire sales org from a leadership standpoint, and it's have champions. Just like you do in sales when you're closing, you need internal champions to get the deal across the line. If you want to roll out a new initiative, you know what you need? You need reps to actually champion that initiative. So there's nothing better than saying, hey, Nick, this outbound initiative is really important for us. Do you mind if we just kind of work together? I want to write out some numbers for what I think it would take for you and walk you through the equation. Now, when I go back to the team and say, hey, Armand and team, I've mapped out a couple different scenarios. I have Nick's scenario of what he thinks it's going to take for him. Nick, you want to share how you came up with those numbers and tell the team what they might be able to take away? Armand, you want to share yours? So empower your team a little bit. You don't have to be as the frontline leader doing everything and doing all of the hyping. And what I personally don't want to do as a leader is say, here's my system, everyone use it. I want people to feel like it's their system too. So build those internal champions. That's a really great way to launch any new initiative, especially outbound, is to get those internal champions.
Okay, so we've got the team bought in. How do you then, as a leader, make sure people actually do this without becoming a total another micromanager, which is something I know you mentioned a lot of managers are scared of?
Every leadership team that I work with, when I say the word accountability, I say, what do you think about? And most people say micromanaging. And accountability and micromanagement are very different. Accountability to me means more visibility into something, and it's being held to a specific standard that I want to be held to. Micromanagement is stepping in and doing things for people or controlling how they do things in a way that doesn't really affect the outcome that much. So accountability is what we want to do. Now, to take this a step further, you want to be very prescriptive about the guidance that you make, though. So if we use exercise as an analogy, both of you two gentlemen are pretty fit. You probably get this. If you had never gone to the gym to lift weights before, and I'm a personal trainer and I want to put you on a program, I'm not just going to say, hey, Nick, so you're going to need to lift weights 4 times a week. Those arms are looking pretty weak, dude. Like, you definitely need to work on those guns. You need to go to the gym for 4 times a week. So one of the days you're going to do push, the other day you're going to do pull. How are you feeling after that guidance? You're like, okay, I've never really been in a gym before. I don't know how to do a lot of these lifts. It's the same exact thing with outbound. Just because I know how to dial a phone number in a phone and hit send on an email doesn't mean I know how to outbound. So before you talk block and tackle of when to do it, do they know how to do the skills? The skills are targeting. I need a good practice of account selection. How do I tier them out? How do I focus that in the right areas? Messaging. Hey, when I do get someone on the phone, what do I say to them? When I do want to write an email, what should that email say? When I get an objection, all of the skill components of it, you need to have nailed down. And then I want to be very prescriptive around the activity and what to expect. So if we use calls as an example, you guys are working on a cold calling book right now. I don't know if it'll be released by the time this comes out, but what I love is that you guys are so prescriptive around, hey, you're probably going to be able to make around 30 calls if you're not using a dialer per hour. So instead of saying, Nick, you need to make a 1 hour of calls every day to hit your number, coaching is, hey, Nick, typically when people are doing this, they can make around 25 to 30 calls per hour. How many hours do you think it's going to take for you to be able to make the number of calls that you need to make? Okay, cool. I'm probably going to do 4 or 5 hours. When do you think you're least likely to procrastinate doing that? What do you feel comfortable with me holding you accountable to? Dude, if the person wants to make calls at the end of the day instead of the beginning and they actually follow through with it, like, why do we need to be so controlling over when they do it? But I think you need prescriptive guidance around what is the best practice around the activity and actually coach. Ask the person what they want to do, what they think that they should do. But they need to be given baseline parameters and prescriptive guidance around how to actually do it.
So let's just pretend that you're coaching the coach. Manager goes and has a conversation with one of their SDRs. And they're like, look, it'll typically take you an hour to make 30 dials. As an AE, you might need to make 30 dials a day, what have you. And things start going off track. You find that 1 week it's 100 dials, the next week it's 150, the next week it's 100. How do you win, or how do you transition from being, okay, what do you want to do, to no, this is how you're going to do it?
It's a great question. The thing that I find really weird is that I meet with a rep on Monday and they want to make 150 calls, and then we just don't talk about it again until the next one-on-one the Monday after. What about all of the time in between? I'm a really big fan of the midweek check-in call. There should be we called them drop-ins back in the day. Wednesday, there should be a drop-in call for reps that are like not hitting the target that they need to from an outcome standpoint. Put 15-minute drop-ins with these folks. On Wednesday, you've made 30 and it's Wednesday. What's your plan to make it up, Armand? What can I hold you accountable to? And more importantly, what are you going to hold yourself accountable to? Don't let an entire week go by without someone hitting their activity. Like, especially if it's an SDR, that's their job. You should be looking at it on a daily basis as a manager.
You should know before the end of the week if they're going to be off pace on their activity commitment. The Wednesday check-in, I would always pull up the SDR dashboard and I would screenshot it at the end of Wednesday. And I would be like, here's everyone who's at the 50% plus mark for the week. I would draw a red line across it. And I would say, if you're not past this line, I hope you have a 2 p.m. dial blitz scheduled. And so, Jason, it sounds like one place that you're reinforcing this is inside of your one-on-ones. Where are some of the other places that you can hold your team accountable to prospect?
The weekly team meeting is another great one. So if you do your weekly team meetings also on Mondays, let's say, having everyone set their goals in that meeting and bring it into the meeting and tell everyone what they are going to do that week is super powerful. I love transparency. And then the other thing that I recommend, I did this back when I was running call centers. The call center manager that I worked with, I was like, dude, you need to be sending out the activity. Like once in the morning, there's an update. Lunchtime, there's an update. At the end of the day, there's an update. Maybe you're not doing quite that much as an SDR manager, but a midweek check-in, a midday, like there needs to be something at least once daily. Here's where we're at on the week. Here is goal versus actual. And it needs to be public, transparent. The accountability should come through peer pressure. It should come through everyone else is hitting their target except for me. You don't want to be the manager that has to have the one-on-one accountability conversations all the time. You really want peer pressure. The one-on-ones, the team meetings, the Slack updates that you put out on a daily basis. And if you need to, the Wednesday check-in meeting is something I'm a really big fan of. And don't make it just like did you hit your activity target or not? Come into that check-in call with, hey, by the way, I listened to one of your calls. I found that you're doing this one thing around how you handle this objection. I had a quick tip for you. But that extra bit of touch, you can't do this out of sight, out of mind kind of thing as a frontline leader.
Yeah, the public accountability thing is really powerful. Armand, I know this was something you would do when you would run the Monday morning team meeting at PAVE, where it was like everybody had commits and you were holding people accountable to it. And then in the next week's meeting, like you were looking at rep of the week for each segment for people who actually hit those goals. It gives you that extra motivation to be like, I don't want to be the one person who's not putting in the time and effort and energy to do my prospecting. And it actually reminds me of something that another guest on this show John Scherer shared with us, which was actually public accountability around pipeline, where he would share after his pipeline reviews the next actions and the health of the pipeline with the entire organization for every single rep. And no rep wanted to have a bunch of bad marks on that report. And so that was how he incentivized the right behaviors. One of the things that you were talking about related to enablement, Jason, was you were saying way too many enablement sessions are focused on how to use the tech and tooling, and not enough on how to actually execute within the job to be done. And so my question for you is, if I am a manager listening to this and I've got a team of AEs and I'm like, some of these folks haven't prospected in a while, what are the minimum viable skills that I need to make sure that these people have beyond just, you talked about targeting the right accounts and you talked about like some basic messaging. Are there other things where I'm like, these need to be top priority that I empower the team with from a skill perspective?
A great question. One thing that I would also share is a person that has not made cold calls shouldn't be teaching other people how to make cold calls. So the kicker there is you may not, as a frontline leader, be able to have much impact in like how they run the session, but you could reach out to them and say, hey, one thing I think would be really good. Nick has just been crushing it on the phones. Can we get him to share how he's doing it in the enablement session? And you coach and guide him. The best enablement teams that I've worked with, the people that are running the sessions, they want to take a back seat to a rep that is actually doing it well. So that's a really big piece. So you talked about skill standpoint. So yeah, targeting account selection, that's in territory planning, is the most underrated skill. I don't feel like any company really has a consensus on how they teach it. Everyone just does their own stuff. There's cold calling. There's how to send a cold email. There's the discipline around my time management. And if you guys want to have a little bit of fun, there's how do I work LinkedIn into the mix. Those are really the core components, along with being able to handle objections. But really it's targeting. What do I say with people when I interact with them across the channels that I'm going to do it? And how do I handle objections? I like to keep it super simple.
I want to push on the piece with the enablement folks, because we have many enablement people who I love who listen to this podcast. I've had many enablement people, and the best ones view their job as a director, not as a movie star. You're sitting in the director chair. You're making sure that the scene looks right. You're helping them structure the information, because these sellers aren't professional teachers. They're professional sellers. And so you can identify the gaps in their curriculum, but they're still the ones who have the camera on them, because that's who the team trusts, and they're going to get way more tactical than you are. Jason, I want to ask you another question in form of an objection that AEs will oftentimes give me when I get them to prospect. They'll say, Armand, I have no issue prospecting, but I'm not going to do the same kind of prospecting that Jimmy, the SDR, is going to do over there. Jimmy's scraping all of the contacts, pulling all the leads. They're working the bottom of the barrel, C tier and B tier accounts. I'm going to be strategic and be a sharpshooter when it comes to AE prospecting. So I'm curious, from your perspective, is there a difference between AE and SDR prospecting? And if so, what is that?
Yeah, it really depends on your sales motion. On the enterprise and strat level, absolutely. If you're doing something that's a little more transactional and small mid-market, it's probably not going to be that much different. So I'll speak to folks that are working large deals. When I say a large deal, 50 to 100K plus, let's say, there's a couple different ways that you can do it. I think a lot of these ways work. It's really about the working relationship. The big no-no, this drives me crazy, when the AE treats the SDR like they report to them. You can't do that. It's a partnership. You have to collaborate, and you can't have an environment as a leadership team where the AE just tells the SDR what to do and they have to listen. That is not going to work. So you need guidance around how they should approach an account. So typically in a larger enterprise type environment, you might have an account executive go high and an SDR go low. But the caveat here, I worked with a client that they had this flow of AE goes high, SDR goes low, and the AEs weren't doing outbound. So no one was calling the VPs in the C-suite. So there has to be some follow through with that. What I would have as an org on the SDR side is I would be as the rep and the manager. That's the type of stuff that I would look at in the accounts that they're working, is who is actually getting these touches, and the SDR can provide some pushback to the AE. So AE goes high, SDR goes low. That's a really easy way to do it. The other thing that you can do that gets really interesting too is you can say, hey, we're going to split by persona, industry, use case, account size, etc. So what you might do is you might say, hey, SDR has 3 months of career experience. You also might split up the work with the account. I'm a really big fan of, hey, do the account planning together. Have the AE bring the account plan essentially to the SDR of who we want to reach out to. And the SDR does a lot of the work of, hey, do we have email addresses, phone numbers, like all of the list building on the account. But the most important part is this cannot be AE bosses around the SDR. It cannot work like that.
The way that oftentimes I've seen it work best with an AE and SDR is, to your point, it's almost this V-shaped process where the account planning happens together at the top. SDR then goes and dives down and starts ripping through every single account. They start finding new information about that account that could never happen in the account planning. And then it's the SDR's job to bring that information back to the AE so that AE can, in the most efficient fashion possible. So oftentimes what I would have SDRs do with their AEs is I would say, bring your AEs the list of the 15 accounts that need their attention and almost pre-write them 10 notes to power, or have them go ask your VP of sales to ghostwrite those notes. I would oftentimes do this with my CEO. I was obviously working my own territory, both as a rep and as a VP of sales. But then at the end of the day, I would have a punch list of 20 Loom videos that I would say, you need to send 20 Loom videos to these 20 accounts at the end of the day. So he would just sit in front of his computer and he would record 20 videos back to back to back. So whether you're an AE or an SDR, that's how you actually get leverage out of your SDRs, is you make them feel like they own the process, but then you set up these boomerangs so that they come back to you at certain moments that are critical to sharpshoot an account.
One of the things that I've observed is AEs and SDRs empowering them with skill training rather than here's how you use our tooling. When you train on some of these outbounding skills, are you having AEs and SDRs in the same session, or are you doing separate sessions?
I try to train them in the same room on topics where they're going to be doing the same thing. So if it's how to cold call, how to cold email, etc., I want them in the same room. And the reason for that is, dude, I really feel like we give AEs way too much credit in this department. There's so many AEs that have call reluctance that don't pick up the phone or don't believe that cold calling, they think it's dead. So getting them in the same room is good for alignment, and just, I think it helps them see the skill gaps that they have. Now, if we're going to talk about block and tackle productivity type stuff, yeah, that's a very different exercise as an AE to go through than as an SDR. So I think it depends on the skill that you're working on, but I would err on the side of having them in the same enablement sessions, unless it's specific to their role.
I was just mapping out our 4-week AE onboarding program. And what will happen is SDR onboarding will be 2 weeks. AEs and SDRs, their first 2 weeks look almost identical. The only thing that happens is SDRs just stop at week 2 because they don't go through discovery training or demo training and all of that stuff. In other words, the AEs are inside of almost every single SDR onboarding training, because the reality is, I know most of the time you learn bad habits when you were cold calling for someone else, or most of the time you learn bad cold email habits, or most of the time you probably didn't get a manager who really made you do any outbound. And so if nothing else, you need to learn how we outbound.
All right, so Jason, you've been working with a lot of sales teams who have been standing up outbound squads and getting their team to start self-sourcing pipeline. What are some of the common mistakes that you're seeing people make when they're doing this?
There's 2 really big ones that we didn't talk about yet in the episode. We've talked about messaging, but I want to double down on who creates the messaging. I see this all the time still, where marketing creates the sequences for sales to use, or one sales manager creates all of the outbound messaging for people. And when you create messaging in a silo, or have an exec that hasn't sold a deal in many years that you would never trust in a sales call to run by themselves, create messaging, you get 2 bad things. One is the messaging is not going to be good. And 2, the buy-in is going to be really low because people didn't feel like they got to participate in it. So you do want to create that outbound squad that I mentioned before, knowledge and experience selling directly to that persona to participate in messaging creation. The second thing is enablement for frontline leaders. The biggest software companies in the world are just now like building internal enablement programs for frontline leaders. It's been the most neglected piece of the puzzle. And with that being said, it's not that the frontline leaders, it's not that they don't necessarily know how to do outbound, which I see that a lot. Do they know how to talk about it in a one-on-one? Do they know how to set goals? Do they know how to get people bought into doing it? Do they know how to provide coaching? around what's a good cold call versus a bad one. I can't tell you how many leaders participate in some of the trainings that I'm doing, and I hear them in the role plays. Like, we need to work on that, because if that's how you're practicing with your reps, like, you're not showing them success. So you need to make sure that you need to do just as much enablement for your frontline leaders as your reps. Training content will only last as long as the ability of your frontline leaders to enable it and reinforce it.
I could not agree more. For whatever reason, the AE Manager Toolkit is all about how to do pipeline reviews and deal reviews, and nothing about how to actually critique cold calls. So, Jason, phenomenal show. Unfortunately, it is still, in your 4 to 5 appearances on the show, it is still not 37 minutes to President's Club. It's unfortunately still 30 minutes to President's Club. So we have to move to the final question. And the final question is, we talked about many good habits that sales leaders can exhibit, but now it's time to talk about a bad one. So what is one bad habit that all sales leaders should break so that all teams get a little bit better?
Not taking feedback well, especially in a public setting. The best VP of sales that I've ever worked with, what I saw this individual do was not only ask for feedback, but get really bad, like, feedback delivered in a really poor way from one of their frontline leaders on a group call, and they took it like a champ. I don't know what kind of conversation they had one-on-one after that, but they took it like a champ. They rephrased back what they heard the person saying, and then they actually followed through and did the thing. On the other hand, the worst VP of sales that I've ever worked with got feedback from one of his managers on a call. He completely shut this woman down, and then the entire call got really awkward after that. He's asking for feedback from everyone. No one's giving it because he did not welcome that feedback. Creating emotional safety on your team is so important. So make sure that you take feedback well, restate back what you think the person said and the point that they're trying to make, and then take action on it and let people know that you follow through with it.
Jason, amazing show. Everyone, hang on for a 60-second recap coming up soon. Alrighty, Nick, it is time for a 2x2 recap from this episode with Jason Bay. What do you have for your 2?
So first, if you're going to be setting these prospecting expectations, you've got to hold people accountable. And there's a couple places in this episode we talked about you can hold people accountable. 1 is in your one-on-ones. 2 is by setting public goals for the entire team in team meetings. Have people set their goals and say what they're going to do if they miss those goals. And then 3, we talked about the midweek Slack check-in that Armand would send out, where you've got, hey, here's how everyone's doing pacing. If you're below pace, you better have a plan to make some calls later this afternoon. So that's number 1. Number 2 was when you have a new training or enablement or empowerment initiative as a leader, you've got to find champions on your team to help with that initiative. And the example that Jason gave was, hey, if you're doing this math exercise, it shouldn't just be you alone at 7 o'clock on a Sunday running the math. You should get with one of your AEs and have them run their math, and get with another and have them run their math, and have them present the math to the team. That way it's real, and you can see some of the variances in data across different sellers.
Number 3, it is awesome when enablement wants to run a session. The way that they run a session is they get the star players on the field and they add structure to the training. You figure out what the best reps are doing, and then you structure their content so that there aren't any gaps. And then lastly, number 4, math your way to quota. If you're not sure where to start with the number of opportunities you need to get to hit your quota, and then back it out from a 30% win rate to get the number of opportunities you need in pipeline, and then back out another 30% to assume that 30% of your meetings will turn into opportunities. Alrighty, Nick, how can people help us out here?
So this episode was actually inspired by an edition of our 30 Minutes to President's Club newsletter that Jason Guest wrote that was for AEs, teaching them how to self-source 30% of their pipeline. And so if you're a leader listening to this and you're like, hey, I want to teach some of the lessons from an AE perspective to my team, we have a link in the show notes to that edition that Jason wrote. I found it really helpful. I think your team will too.